Thank you, Jim. Well, yeah, it's a pleasure for me to be part of the convention this year. And as Jim said, I've recently published a book called Radio War, and it's really exclusively focused on the Radio Security Service, which is hopefully of significant interest for radio amateurs and the role that they played right the way through the Second World War. It was really the genesis of the book was from my first book, which was about D-Day, and I'm actually a career SIGINT, signals intelligence practitioner. So it's an organisation I knew very, very little about. So it really spawned the second book, which was Radio War. And many of you know the crux of Second World War SIGINT is very, very in the sort of the public perception is very much focused on Bletchley Park and the work of the code breakers in Bletchley. But the story of World War II signals intelligence is much bigger. It's an industrial scale process, not just in Britain, but overseas as well. But I'm just going to focus particularly on the Radio Security Service. I'll talk through its origins, its work, how it was organised, and then just a few vignettes from it as well. So they were very much the subject matter experts for the German intelligence service and other aspects of Axis intelligence around the world. But the origins really stem back to the First World War. And at the start of the First World War, licensed and unlicensed radio stations had been closed down to prevent any breaches of the Defence of the Realm Act in August 1914. And I've just thrown up this quite nice schematic of the plots of Zeppelin routes coming across the North Sea from Germany in May 1917. And it's really just to emphasise the point that the start of the First World War really was saw the dawn of signals intelligence in Britain. A number of intercept and direction finding, or DF, stations were opened up, mostly on the East Coast, focused on the German Navy, German Air Force, and there were certainly a number of those were actually started by radio amateurs, and a famous one being Hunstanton on the East Coast in Norfolk. Started by Clark and Hippersley. And so the intertwining of amateurs in the story of the genesis of signals intelligence in Britain is very, very, very strong. So in 1915, the Secretary of the Wireless Society of London, which was the predecessor for the RSGB, Rennie Klein, wrote to the Times newspaper suggesting members should be recruited to monitor the airwaves for what we refer to as illicit wireless transmissions, so transmissions from German agents operating in Britain. But there was no real active use of radio amateurs during the First World War. And a few years later, in 1928, a standing interdepartmental subcommittee of the Committee for Imperial Defence, or CID, recommended the War Office should use radio amateurs for such a role to work alongside the already established signals intelligence units within the Military and Foreign Office, which monitored transmissions overseas for the Government Code and Cipher School, or GC&CS. But really, one of the most important things that happened just before the war was this chap came onto the scene, Lieutenant Colonel Adrian Simpson. He was formerly Deputy Managing Director of Marconi and had intercept experience during the First World War. And he wrote this fairly seminal report on illicit wireless intercept, which resonated around government circles. One of the things it suggested was a technical advisory committee to oversee priorities and requirements. And he also set out a plan, you can see on the left, of how to structure and organise the country in the way they wanted to bring in radio amateurs into the fold. So originally the organisation was called the Illicit Wireless Intercept Organisation, or IWIO, but it eventually formed various organisational structures, but it fell certainly from 1941 onwards under SIS control, like MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service. under the chap there called Brigadier Richard Gambier Parry, who was the controller, or the designated controller of the RSS, and based at Hanslope Park. But he oversaw various other aspects of communications, security, and communications apparatus for British intelligence during the Second World War. One of the main parts of the RSS structure was the signals group, and I'll talk a bit about various aspects as we go on this talk. But certainly the basis for the entire organisation was the GPO, the General Post Office telephone conference system, which was a structure around the country, and it was the basis, the infrastructure that was in place to allow intercept from stations around the country to be played through multiple direction finding stations almost instantaneously to get directional fixes on those transmissions. So the organisation was first located in C Wing of Wormwood Scrubs Prison, co-located with MI5 at the time. And MI5 had been pushed out to Wormwood Scrubs because of the Luftwaffe attacks in central London. And they were linked by teleprinter to Bletchley Park. It was originally part of MI8, MI8 being the military intelligence unit that oversaw signals intelligence administration and organisation. And they were designated MI8C. But as I mentioned, in 1941, they became part of the Secret Intelligence Service. So the story of the Radio Security Service really stretches across all three of the modern day intelligence services. Probably most interest to all the radio amateurs listening is the work of the Voluntary Interceptors, or the VIs. And the basis of that was from Lord Jimmy Sandhurst, or Ralph Mansfield, who put forward a proposal for a nationwide network of interceptors, DF specialists, who could get into that ground wave. And he was certainly wanting those personnel to be distributed every 10 to 15 miles, so a nationwide network. And he put forward a memo to the director of MI5 in October 1938 to expand this fledgling organisation. And he discussed this with Arthur Watts, the former president of the RSGB, and started to recruit RSGB members, which would form the backbone of the radio monitors required for the new service. The first 50 VIs that were recruited identified over 600 German agents operating in occupied Europe. But it's estimated there were between 1,500 to 2,000 recruited across the entire country, and a couple of fairly famous ones there. In the top left, that's Helena Crawley, who I think's recently died, aged 103. She was based in the Orkneys. And Ray Fortley, the chap in the centre there with the Royal Observer Corps uniform. So these voluntary interceptors would operate in their sheds, in their attics, in their front rooms, real sort of dad's army stuff. As an individual, they were vetted by local police, but they were really recruited because of their experience and their skills in operating radio receivers. And they split the country into 9 regions, each of which was run by a regional officer who would typically have 200 to 400 VIs in each of those regions. They were typically given Royal Observer Corps or Royal Signals uniforms so they could hide in the noise and give them some form of cover. But the agreement was they would contribute just more than 48 hours a month, which would allow them to avoid home guard or fire watch duties. Many actually did more than 160 hours a month. They were very, very passionate about what they were doing. Obviously, a lot of them had full-time jobs as well. They were recruited because of their Morse skills typically. They were graded into three grades. So grade A would be 23 words per minute, grade B would be 20 words per minute, and grade C, 18 words per minute. And the basis of their work was to fill out these log sheets. You can see an example in the bottom right, filled out by a chap called Bob King, who many of you may know. He died fairly recently, unfortunately. But these log sheets were essentially what the VIs filled in every day when they were monitoring a specific frequency, or they were doing a general search over a specific frequency range. And they were sent onwards in a double envelope to a fairly anonymous PO Box 25, as it was known, and more on that later. So the logs were often sent back to them with comments. You can see some of the comments in red on this particular log sheet, which would say things like "watch please" or "okay covered thanks" or "more please." But it would give the VIs a bit of direction on what to look for and to spur them on into doing even more for the organisation. They were formed into typically local groups who would have a VI group leader, who was then in turn responsible to those regional officers I just mentioned in various parts of the country. The regional officers would have a small staff. They would often have their own office in a local town or city, and they would hold occasional meetings with the group, which were often in local pubs, in the back rooms of local pubs, or directly with the VIs themselves, encouraging them to spend many hours diligently searching for and copying stations to send messages. And to give you some idea of the scale of the operation, by 1941, the logs were flooding into PO Box 25, reaching a peak of 10,000 pages in a single day. It was an industrial scale effort, and subsequently they were responsible for the vast amount of target knowledge on not just the German intelligence service networks in occupied Europe, but all over the world as well. And I just want to highlight one particular individual that is a remarkable man, genuinely. Many of you probably know that, if you know me, you know I'm disabled. This chap, Edward Bridge, in the middle of the COVID restrictions last year, his local town, Burscough in Lancashire, unveiled a blue plaque on his old house. He was awarded a military medal during the First World War after capturing a German machine gun post in the Somme with the King's Liverpool Regiment, and after that he was quite severely injured. And those injuries left him completely bedridden for the rest of his life. And he developed an interest in radios. He learnt Morse code and obtained a wireless license. He was subsequently enlisted into the RSS, and through his work against Group 10 or X traffic, he started exploiting a German Abwehr network, the Abwehr being the German military intelligence service. This network was operating in New Jersey in the US under the double agent William Siebold. One of the agents in the network was a German agent called Fritz Duquesne, who was running 33 agents, and it subsequently became known as the Duquesne spy ring. And the RSS and Bridge in particular, and the FBI were monitoring the network, showing Abwehr activity, not just in the USA, but also in South America and Mexico. The network was disrupted in June 1941, and in a trial in the Federal District Court in Brooklyn, New York, which began on the 3rd of September 1941, the 33 members of the network were given over 300 years in prison. And Duquesne himself was given 18 years. It's still the biggest espionage case in American history that ended in convictions. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill personally wrote to Bridge, and I quote, "I was stirred to hear of your splendid war work. You have not allowed physical disability to prevent you playing a fine part in the fight against Nazi Germany. May I send you all good wishes and my warmest congratulations upon your success." The RSS was integral to the MI5 double cross system that many of you may have read about. They were instrumental in identifying agents and understanding knowledge of their arrival in Britain for MI5, and also understanding how far the disinformation was spreading in German intelligence. Among the first 21 spies to arrive in September 1940 were 4 that come in by dinghy, 2 by parachute, and some by fishing boat. and several arrived among the large number of genuine refugees which flooded in during the German occupation of Western Europe. But not all these arrivals were enthusiastic or competent. Some gave themselves up as soon as possible, and some were easily caught because of their ineptitude. But few came without our prior knowledge due to the radio Morse intercepts made by the Radio Security Service. Many who tried to avoid capture and please their master did so because their families were being held as hostages. Out of all the illicit entries into Britain at the start of the Second World War, nearly 30 were made into double agents, working on our behalf unknown to the enemy. They were given code names, and at least 4, codenamed Tate, Zigzag, Tricycle and Garbo, were of great value, especially Garbo in the run-up to D-Day. I'm sure many of you have read the Ben McIntyre books, which you can find out more details of these agents. Another agent, Snow, he was also very important in the early days of the RSS when they were working in close collaboration with MI5. Now, I mentioned PO Box 25. PO Box 25 was this location, a place called Arkley View in Barnet, which is in North London, which opened on the 3rd of October 1940. This was very much the operational and administrative hub for the organisation. So those intercept reports, those log sheets were sent there, and it became an industrial process. Much of it was ABVIA hand cipher, but there was some machine Enigma traffic that came through as well. Arkley was run by Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Morton Evans, who was the Deputy Controller of the RSS. He was originally a company commander with 4th Battalion, the Welsh Regiment. His course of the war was to fatefully change after eating a Pembrokeshire sausage, which infected him with trichinosis. On his sick leave in spring 1940, he was returning from his medical board on the train, and he met Captain Edmund Vale, who was the RSS Regional Officer for Wales, who encouraged him to join the RSS. And he made a very quick rise up the hierarchy. Traffic analysis was a hugely important speciality for the RSS, akin to what other pioneers in this technique at places like Sixter, the traffic analysis section in Hut 6 at Bletchley Park, under people like Gordon Welshman. So the RSS collection and direction finding resources were collated around a number of groups, each of which was ostensibly a radio net controlled out of a hub. The study for each group was the responsibility of a group officer who reconstructed the signals plans of the communications networks using direction finding and other sources to discover those locations. And the first 2 groups I'll mention, Group 1 was called Harry. This was an ABVIA network controlled from the Hamburg transmitter. And this network had some very long distance radio links with clandestine agents operating overseas as far afield as South America, the USA, Angola, and Mozambique. The one that you can see in front of you is Group 2, which is referred to as Bertie, Bertie being Berlin. And this was again another ABVIA station, but by far the most significant of all the RSS groups. The network had links and subcenters across Europe as far afield as Poland, Norway, and Spain, which routed daily information back to Berlin. But the groups weren't just focused on German intelligence services. Group 12, for example, was focused on Russian clandestine transmissions. Group 9 focused on Palestine traffic. So it was a much bigger apparatus than just the German intelligence services. One of the most secret parts of the Radio Security Service was the Radio Intelligence Section, or the RIS, led by Hugh Trevor Roper, which was based in the Arkley View HQ. Hugh Trevor Roper works alongside Charles Stewart, Stuart Hampshire, Gilbert Ryle, all of which became Oxbridge professors after the war. They were the recipients of Bletchley Park decrypts, as well as other source material on specific radio nets that the RSS was covering. They were responsible to receive, but also maintain and publish target knowledge on enemy intelligence services activity. They guided the priorities for interception and advised group leaders on what to focus resources on. So these were the hub of the machine, and in places like the National Archives, you'll find some very, very comprehensive reports from the RIS on certain aspects of their target knowledge. Hugh Trevor Roper famously broke an Abwehr hand cipher in his flat in Ealing, and when this was reported up to his commanding officer, Colonel Woolwich, he was ordered to write a document about how he'd done it. And unfortunately, that got circulated to his normal customer set, and which caused a bit of friction and reaction with his certainly his MI6 counterparts, because this was very much the province of Bletchley Park, and they were severely reprimanded. In fact, Major Felix Cowgill, who was the new head of the MI6 counter-espionage section, or Section 5, sought a formal court-martial for Trevor Roper. The RSS needed full-time intercept stations, and it created a number around Britain. One of the main ones was Hanslope Park, which was taken over in August 1941. Captain Reggie Wigg was in charge of the advance party, and the building work was completed by May 1942. It very much was the engineering and direction finding headquarters for the organisation. The engineering group was led by one of the world's foremost direction finding engineers of his time, Major Dick Keane, who previously worked for Marconi and was the author of most of the major texts on the subject of radio direction finding. The RSS positions had 66 state-of-the-art HRO receiver positions there. The OIC for the engineering section was a chap called Robin Adey, and at the height of the war, Hanslope had become such an integral part of the signals intelligence machinery on which the RSS had been built that Brigadier Gambier Parry hosted visits from General Eisenhower, Field Marshal Montgomery, and General Alexander. So direction finding was a very big part of the RSS work, and it really goes back to 1938 when the GPO, the General Post Office, created 3 new Adcock DF stations at Sandridge, which was just outside St Albans, Stockland, which is just outside Bridgewater, and Cupar, which is north of Edinburgh. These were all built out of the Post Office's own funds, but it was very much the first RSS radio activity prior to the Second World War. Alongside this existing Adcock DF system, in 1940, a new DF system called Spaced Loop Direction Finder, which had been developed at the National Physical Laboratory, was brought into the RSS by Jerry Openshaw. The central DF plotting control room was actually in Barnet under the control of Openshaw, and they could take bearings up to 500 miles distance, covering HF frequencies between 2 and 30 meg. But the RSS also operated medium frequency DF stations up to frequencies of 3 meg. But they were a similar design, but much larger, with 4 30-metre high guide latticed steel aerials. This system used tanks. You can see them on the back of the truck there, being put into the ground. The concept being locating these tanks in the ground would screen out any radio interference. The tank was connected to 4 external aerials linked to rotatable coils called a goniometer inside the tank, and they had to dig a hole that was 8 foot deep and 13 foot wide to accommodate the tanks. And these were installed at DF sites in St Earth in Cornwall, Wymondham, Bridgewater, Forfar, Thurso, and at Gilderhirk in Northern Ireland. So Wymondham was a typical DF station. It comprised 8 staff. You'd have a sergeant in charge and 7 other ranks. The team would do 3 8-hour shifts, but with only 1 operator at a time actually housed inside the metal tank. During the day, other people around would do routine maintenance work, such as running the auxiliary power generators in case the mains failed, checking the calibration of the DF equipment, and so on. The night shift was probably the worst and most soul destroying, from 2300 to 0700 in the morning, and the operator was on his own entirely, obviously in the dark, in the middle of the ground. There was also a series of mobile detection units which were distributed around the country for what we would call the last mile DF on those illicit signals. So when you're trying to track those enemy agents in a town or in a country, you need pretty good mobile DF systems. So they had 3 remits: to investigate suspect transmitters, after the DF of the signal on instruction for the discrimination group using the DF vans and short range DF units. They maintain listening watches on suspect buildings by setting up stations within a quarter of a mile of the suspect site. Special equipment was used, which was designed by the post office or by the engineering group, which would mechanically mark signals of interest, highlighting frequency and time of transmission. And they'd also provide mobile units for use on the continent, which were deployed certainly during the Normandy campaign onwards, when we took on the second front. Another aspect of the work at Hanslope was reverse engineering. After the Allied invasion of France in June 1944, the Radio Security Service would give implicit instructions to the field security police to make sure any wireless telegraphy sets that they were to come across, particularly those belonging to agents, to understand their design, their operating ranges, and their procedures. This particular set you can see in front of you was from Yves Grillicher, who was operating as a stay-behind agent, I think, in Normandy. So this was around June, July 1944. You can see some of the sets that he was using. Another aspect of the Radio Security Service, which I wasn't aware of, was their vast work and global network coverage. They had numerous resources overseas. They were referred to as special sections and were largely manned by military personnel. But they were sent as far afield as Tanzania, Gibraltar, Egypt, Malta, Palestine, the British Cameroons. They also had liaison officers with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Canada, and a good working relationship with the Royal Canadian Signals, the FBI, and also the US Coast Guard interception units off Northwest Africa in March 1945. I'm just going to highlight one aspect of the overseas work, and that's from MERS, which was the Middle East Radio Service, which was an RSS facility at a military camp in Sidi Bashir, a few miles east of Alexandria in Egypt. Commanded by Captain Jack Hester, and was originally established in February 1941. Alongside Gibraltar, it was the first RSS overseas station, and it had 15 intercept positions. It had a number of interception priorities. For example, Italy, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and the Aegean networks, and had very, very close liaison with the Combined Bureau Middle East, which was Bletchley's outpost in Heliopolis, just outside Cairo, which was the main SIGINT hub for the Middle East. So the Alexandria collection and the Heliopolis logs were transmitted back to Wadden, which is a village just outside Bletchley, the Section 8 HQ for the SIS. The MERS detachments were also deployed out of Sidi Bashir as the battle rolled on through the Middle East and North Africa. And these detachments were sent as far afield as Derna and Benghazi in Libya, and the traffic was relayed back to Cairo. MERS was intercepting at its height around 200 messages a day, and they were certainly responsible for exploiting around 3/4 of the total Aegean network. And certainly a lot of the insights I've got and some of the photographs you can see are from a chap called Ray Wright in New Zealand, who is the chap on the left using the receiver. Gibraltar was another RSS site under the commands of Lieutenant Donnan, and was certainly one of the most active RSS units overseas. It had real success in exploiting traffic, which was conveying Abwehr insight into Allied shipping movements around the Straits of Gibraltar, and exploiting Abwehr agents' traffic in Spain. These Abwehr messages could be intercepted, analysed, translated, decoded, and forwarded through to the Admiralty within 30 minutes of its broadcast. That's pretty phenomenal stuff. There were also RSS facilities out in the Far East. These special wireless sections went by sea to Singapore in January 1941 with 6 mobile units equipped with R106 receivers. The units were commanded by Captain Macmillan from the Royal Corps of Signals and were under the control of the Far East Combined Bureau. Again, that was one of the Bletchley outposts in the Far East. Some sections were deployed to the Royal Navy wireless station in Kranji in Singapore. Others were deployed to Kuala Lumpur. And there was even one mobile unit that was deployed to the Thai border. So very much, it wasn't just a British effort. It was a global effort against the Axis intelligence networks around the world. But even in the Second World War, the Radio Security Service didn't avoid media scrutiny. This was one headline that appeared in the Daily Mirror in February 1941, which exposed the work of the VIs in their houses in Britain. It was highlighted to the authorities and was subsequently revoked. So what became of the Radio Security Service? At the end of the war, Sir Findlater Stewart did a wholesale review of MI5. This was November 1945. And he recommended that the RSS elements should be retained post-war, especially the RSS traffic analysis component. And they recommended that it was transferred to the newly formed Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, at Eastcote in April 1946. So under agreement from the director of GCHQ, Edward Travis, the VI cadre was decreased down to just 250 personnel, but it formed a new organisation which was called the Government Communications Voluntary Radio Service, or GCVRS, which continued doing the work that the RSS had pioneered in the Second World War, but focused now on a new target, the Soviet Union, during the height of the Cold War. The RSS work had been invaluable to breaking the Enigma ciphers in Hut 6 at Bletchley Park. It opened up some new insights into the inner workings of the German intelligence service networks. Over 268,000 messages have been estimated to be decrypted at Bletchley from RSS traffic, most of those from Abwehr Handcipher and Enigma Handcipher. They were most certainly the subject matter experts for the German intelligence services and were integral to the success of the MI5 double-cross deception plans, which, as many of you know, were vital for the success of Allied operations, arguably the most significant for D-Day. So that's the end of my talk. And that's the front cover of my book. It's available from all good booksellers, but I'll be interested in taking any questions. Thank you for listening.
And available from the RSGB, David. Now, I've got a few comments for you and a question. I'll come to the question in a second, but Gordon Hunter, G8WWD, said he was dating a girl in the 70s whose mum had been one of the interceptors. And he only found out by accident because they were watching television one night and there was some Morse code on a program, and the girl's mother was able to read it straight away. And this is the thing, isn't it? That other people would have taken that secret to the grave normally. That's right. That's brilliant. That's a brilliant story.
Yeah, and still there's very few of the RSS operators alive now. They're obviously all in their late 90s and low hundreds. But The ones I interviewed have all been very, very tight-lipped. They still maintain a veil of security even to this day about what they did during the Second World War. It's fascinating to see how indoctrinated they were in the security of what they were being asked to do. A lot of them were unaware of the involvement of Bletchley Park. They were sending their material through to a fairly anonymous PO box and weren't really privy to what happened after that. So it's very interesting and obviously a different world from what we now live in.
Absolutely. Andy Cowley says, my grandfather was a spy in World War II, and he leaves it at that. Come on, Andy, we need to know a bit more than that. Now, this looks a bit complicated. Steve, G4HJ, says, you mentioned Gordon Welchman and traffic analysis. Fort Bridgewood's War Office Y Group, headed by Lieutenant Commander MJW Ellingworth, Major, oh my word, HF Yolovich, who developed TA at Bridgewoods and was the birth of GCHQ. TA, does that mean anything to you?
Yeah, Fort Bridgewood's in Chatham, which was one of the main War Office or Army interception sites before the Second World War. They were certainly some of the pioneers in traffic analysis. It's very much an unreported, or there isn't many books have been written about that sort of component. Obviously, the code breaking effort of Bletchley's, been the subject of a number of films and an awful lot of books. But the traffic analysis component was such an important aspect of signals intelligence work during the Second World War, and prior to that, and post that as well. It's still to this day a very important aspect of the work. In terms of trying to understand the network and the operators within the network, and it's very much so. There's lots of different entities involved, and certainly the RSS was some of the very, very comprehensive. The work they were doing during the Second World War was very, very well respected. And when the RSS was folded in 1946, a lot of the instructors and techniques were brought forward into the modern day GCHQ. They were still using a lot of the tradecraft and understanding about traffic analysis methods had been carried forward into the Cold War. Excellent.
Now, I don't know how long you've been with us, but earlier on we had a keynote speech from Catherine Mitchell, M0IBG, who revealed during a talk that she had relatives who were in the RSS. And she sent a question. She says, I've heard that the World War II voluntary interceptors would have been in particular danger in the event of invasion because they were some of the few people with radio sets kept at home. And she wonders, were their radios and antennas kept hidden when they weren't in use?
I think the recommendations were they had to be fairly discreet in where antennas were placed, because obviously the local communities would spot them sticking out of their roofs and in their back gardens, and it would raise suspicions. As it often did, local police were often called and had to descend on a VI's house, and they would have to explain themselves. So these aspects were a consideration. Obviously, if the German invasion did happen from Operation Sea Lion, it would have changed the landscape. And I think there was invasion plans put in place for the organisation, so they could then work as part of the resistance if that ever came to pass.
Ian Munro says, absolutely fascinating talk, David. Thanks for cramming in so much rare detail. Rob Browning says his neighbour, the late Les Jackson, G3OZ, was a VI who was responsible for getting Rob into radio. And Steve, G4HJE, has come back and he says, my book, Fort Bridgewood's From Victorian Fort to World War II Y Station, Palmerston's Enigma, in brackets. I don't know if would that be the publisher or what? I don't know. It doesn't go into more detail. So very good. Okay, well, look, before you go, I mentioned right at the start that you made an appearance on the telly. I don't know how recently this was, on QI. What was that all about?
It was a couple of weeks ago, yeah.
So it might still be on the iPlayer.
it's all a bit embarrassing. So in my day job, I'm the department historian for GCHQ. So I have to do the odd bit of media work now and again, which is interesting. But yeah, it was fascinating to be part of the program. We actually filmed it in February, and it's just really interesting to see how it's all structured. You know, the whole filming took about 3.5 hours.
That's telly for you.
Yeah, they edited it down to 30 minutes. But yeah, it's fascinating. It was a good laugh as well.
What was it about spies or something, was it?
Spies, sleuths, and secrets. Yeah, it was letter S. So we had numerous bits of our GCHQ collection, a couple of secure phones and things like that to show them.
Oh, I must have missed that one. I'll look it out. And somebody. Steve says G4HJE says his book is published by the RSGB. So thanks for clarifying that, Steve. And I don't know if you can answer this one. Paul M0GSX says, hi David, very good presentation. Wonder if you know the weight. I don't know why you would want to know this. Do you know the weight of the mobile sets that Field Ops carried?
No.
They weren't SDR, so I guess they'd be pretty heavy.
Yeah, I imagine so. Everything's man-packable, apparently. They always used to say that in the military.
Yeah. Oh, and a comment from David Thorndike, G4ONM, OMN, great stuff. Thank you. Yeah, that's been really interesting. Thank you very much, David. Now, I take it, because I haven't been supplied with one, you're not a radio amateur yourself?
I'm not. Shamefully, no.
No, don't be ashamed. But if we can interest you...
Yeah, I do talk a lot about it, and I should really.
If you're in the right place, the RSGB website will have all the necessary information. And as Catherine was saying earlier on, the foundation license is, it's a bit of a breeze for her. Shouldn't take too much. All right. A reminder that David's book about the radio security service is also available from the RSGB shop. Thank you very much, David. It's been great.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for
all
listening.
The best now. For now.
All right. Take care.